Duma. I decided to read this book for no other reason than I knew it took place in Florida and I was about to go on a trip there. Kind of a dumb reason considering I was only there for a few days of the roughly 1 month it took me to read this thing, but I think it worked out in my favor anyway. This book relies very heavily on its atmosphere, and I think putting myself in the literal setting of the book did enhance it in some minor way, like reading it in 4D or something. Plus I'm from Minnesota, and the main protagonist is also from Minnesota, and then he goes to Florida, so it's kind of like the perfect little connection there. And it helps also that this book has probably the most vivid atmosphere of any King book I've read up until this point. He just so precisely captures the energy of this colorful, charming, bizarre little island that I didn't even really care that barely any plot happens for like 75% of this book. Literally just Duma itself, like the setting, the island, was enough to keep me engaged. Now, obviously stuff is still happening in the book. Protagonist Edgar Fremantle, who's first person narrating, by the way, that's kind of an interesting, not super common thing for Stephen King books. But he's basically dealing with recovery from this very debilitating construction accident he got in, which left him with one arm and a whole host of other medical issues. Things that were very likely on Stephen King's mind at the time this was written, or it came out at least in 2005, not very long after his car accident, and I'm sure his own recovery from this type of traumatic injury. On top of that, Edgar has just been divorced, so he kind of moves out to Florida just to start fresh. He begins to paint as a means of therapy, basically, and slowly you come to realize that his paintings and the island itself are sort of haunted by this mysterious evil force looming deep within the key. But again, that's more plotty stuff. That isn't initially what drew me into the book, and the book honestly doesn't really start to get into that until later. What initially drew me in is just the descriptions of the island, of the Caldo, as King likes to call it, the Gulf of Mexico. The way King describes sunsets with such detail, I swear the man used like 15 different words to say orange. The strange pink mansion that Edgar lives in, succinctly referred to as Big Pink. The way the shells murmur underneath the foundation of the house. It's just so cozy and so immersive. And obviously this sort of transportive power is King's bread and butter. He's famous for doing this sort of thing, but even for him, this is a very unique setting. It's not the Northwoods of Maine, it's a beach in Florida. King also does a really great job of letting you soak in the ambiance of this place by creating around it a story which is just very slow moving. I totally understand people's impatience with this story, but I personally loved just meandering around the island for a while, spending time in such a lovely place. The characters in this book are also really great. If there's one thing King usually gets right, regardless of anything else that's going on, it's writing compelling characters with a lot of depth and a lot of realism. Edgar Fremantle's relationship with his daughters, specifically Ilsa, his relationship with his ex-wife Pam, are sharply realistic, and his relationship with the wise Jerome Wireman is maybe one of the best platonic friendship arcs I've ever read in a book. Wireman is this guy who helps take care of Elizabeth Eastlake, who is this old woman who lives down the beach a little ways. She's kind of creepy and disquieting, but the relationship the three of them form turns out to be really interesting, as a lot of Elizabeth's life circumstances bear some pretty striking resemblances to Edgar's life circumstances. She has a very dark history, and that sort of plays into a lot of the mystery and the ominous energy happening on the island. Also, there's Jack Cantori, this college kid who's kind of there just to help Edgar out, to help him acclimate to his life on the island, and he's just kind of like a nice guy, and he's there a lot too. So yeah, within and around all this stuff, you have the actual plot, which is necessary to get into, but again, it was sort of secondary to me. Basically, Edgar's paintings begin to supernaturally reveal information to Edgar that he should not otherwise be able to know. Like, for example, he paints Ilsa's new boyfriend before he ever sees him or even knows of his existence. He paints a bunch of objects in Pam's apartment that he has not seen and wouldn't be able to know that she got. Then he also starts painting these really creepy images of a decrepit old boat called Percy, and with each installment of the series, the boat gets closer and closer and closer. Super creepy. Loved it. His paintings are so good that he actually becomes a somewhat renowned artist in the area, and he ends up hosting his own gallery. The story grows darker, though, as it is slowly revealed that the supernatural element giving power to Edgar's paintings is actually evil, and also used Elizabeth and her paintings 80 years ago basically to kill her whole entire family, and it's beginning to do the same thing to Edgar as his therapist, Dr. Kamen, ends up tragically dying, and then his daughter Ilsa also gets tragically killed. Again, these are spoiler reviews, so it kind of starts crescendoing out of control. And I will say that some of the more technical aspects of the plot of this book, especially towards the end, did begin to feel somewhat silly to me. Percy basically being this eldritch ocean deity whose spirit resides in a little China doll washed up in the Gulf, and how her primary weakness is apparently being held captive in a container of fresh water. I don't know, I feel like King was explaining stuff a little too hard towards the end, especially with Edgar and Wireman and Jack when they're traversing the old mansion towards the actual climax of the book. But that honestly does not detract from my feelings towards the whole book overall that much. As cliched as it is to say, this is very much a journey, not the destination type of book. I will say one thing that surprised me about Duma, given how pleasant the setting is how many genuinely terrifying scenes and sequences are in here. I like to get on my high horse sometimes and talk about how a lot of Stephen King books are incorrectly labeled as horror when they're just simply not horror books. It happens all the time to a bunch of his books that are sci-fi or fantasy or just like literary fiction. He's got a ton of material that's not horror, but Duma is horror, I would say, and I wasn't really expecting it to be. The scene where Elizabeth's twin little sisters, Tessie and Laura, are being chased into the ocean by this disgusting Lovecraftian frog creature as birds are flying upside down and the sky is switching back and forth between blue and red, scared the shit out of me. Surreal and awful in a way that only Stephen King can pull off. There are also a lot of descriptions of like disgusting wet ocean zombie creatures that got me pretty good. And one of the last scenes in the book, which is both horrifying and also really sad, is where Edgar has to confront his dead daughter Ilsa, who he drew in the sand in the throes of his grief, and there's this whole thing about how his paintings sort of come to life. I thought that was a very intense and scary scene, and I thought it harkened back a lot to Pet Sematary with regards to the idea that, like, if you have the opportunity to raise someone from the dead, you should not do that because it just something bad will happen. Honestly, I think the main reason I enjoyed this book so much is that it is just so quintessentially Stephen King. Beautifully realistic characters, completely immersive setting, and a plot whose mileage may vary. But the vibes here are completely undeniable, so unique and mysterious and colorful and unknowable. Duma simultaneously feels like a very real place and a strange liminal reality that could not possibly exist on Earth, like a sunset made up of colors you've never seen before. Just for that alone, I think it's worth a read. I would probably put it somewhere near my top 10 Stephen King books. I'm gonna give it 9 Floridas out of 10.